So I want to tell you a story about how complexity has been navigated in a very different setting to the one that we've heard about so far. It's from the area that I focus on, which is international development. And it's about how an aid agency working in the 1990s and 2000s was able to deal with child malnutrition, a very complex problem. And I want to use this problem to talk about the broader issues of this conference. Now, before we actually get going, I just want to ask a question of the audience. Who here owns a bicycle? Can I have a show of hands? Okay, keep your hands up if you ride that bicycle regularly. Okay, who here thinks they could design a bicycle from scratch? Okay. Well, in fact, this is how the bicycle came into being. The modern bicycle, in the terms that Tim Brown used yesterday, even this most Newtonian of technologies, actually came into being through a process of Darwinian tinkering, through a process of evolution, of selection, variation, amplification. Now, Brian Arthur of the Santa Fe Institute has written brilliantly about this in his book, The Nature of Technology, and any of you that are interested in innovation really should pick this book up. Now, policy and practice, as has been alluded to already, just like forms of technology, like the bicycle, like the riders of bicycles, have come into being through a process of continual adaptation, learning, and adjustment. And this is also how our organizations and our institutions have come into being. Now, the key point here is that our responses to complexity also need to be adaptive in order to deal with this. Now, my work, as I said, focuses on international development and humanitarian work, and acknowledging and harnessing the adaptive potential of poor people in developing countries underpins one of the most important innovations that's happened in recent years, called positive deviance. Now, some of you may know this term, some of you may not. What I want to talk about is my research in the book that Adrian talked about earlier, which explains how this approach came about, the importance of complexity principles within it, and this very unconventional approach to public sector work that it entails. So the first person to come up with the phrase positive deviance was a nutritionist called Marion Zeitlin. And she used it to describe the off-the-chart performance in health, in growth, in development of certain children in a community compared to others. And the data that she described, the data that she identified, described power laws. Essentially, not charts like the left-hand side there, which had a nice average, but charts like the right-hand side, where you had long tails. What she identified was that there were children at the top of these long tails who she described as positive deviants. And this was an adaptive phenomenon. These were children whose parents, whose families had access to exactly the same resources as everyone else, but their performance in terms of recovery from operations, in terms of their growth, in terms of achievement, was off the chart. Now, this is a real challenge for the public sector, because the public sector is much better at dealing with averages, much better at dealing with averages. So how did we decide to move beyond this average thinking, if you like, in both senses of the term? Now, the first attempt to operationalize this way of thinking was in Bangladesh in the early 1990s. And what they tried to do was address diarrheal infection and malnutrition. And the NGOs and the governments involved used a series of scientific behavioral trials to identify the factors that put children at the top of these trials. But what they actually came out with was essentially an attempt to extract these, design them, and then represent them to the community as ideal best practices, which could then be rolled out in top-down standardized ways. It didn't work. And I would argue that the reason for this is it was a classic public sector approach about analyzing, extracting, categorizing, delivering, and controlling. What John talked about as the global standard of public sector work. And I think Eve also talked about efficiency and discipline. Now, this took the idea of positive deviance and applied it in a very Newtonian way. It's a manifestation of what's been called 19th century physics envy, which is at the heart of the public sector. It assumes that the world is one gigantic clockwork. And as Helga talked about yesterday, the approach is not really appreciating and navigating complexity. It's about reducing it. It's about being embarrassed by it. Also very much resonates with Don's approach, the old paradigm of management. Now, positive deviance, as it's known today, is underpinned by a very different kind of approach, one which is much less Newtonian, much more Darwinian. It's much more about resilience and values. And it came about because of the work of two extraordinary aid workers, Jerry and Monique Sternin, who were working in Vietnam in the 1990s. And they were facing some very difficult conditions. And just occasionally, just enough pressure is just what is needed in order to trigger innovation. What they had to do was try and develop an approach to deal with malnutrition in a country that was experiencing over 65% malnutrition rates amongst under fives. In the early 1990s, it was still suffering from economic embargoes, and there were all kinds of social problems and political problems. And there were attempts to deal with malnutrition by providing supplementary feeding. The government would go in and give children extra food. But these were very expensive to administer, and the benefits never extended beyond the lifetime of the programs. A classic example of a Newtonian approach to a complex problem. So what the Sternins did, they originally worked with 4 communities and a population of 2,000 children under the age of 3. And they invited the communities to identify poor families who'd managed to avoid malnutrition against all the odds, essentially the positive deviants. They faced the same challenges, the same problems, and yet their children were not malnourished. And what they identified was that these families were at the top end of the long tail. They were engaged in behaviors that others did not. And that long tail is actually a classic signature, mathematical signature of a complex system. Now, the Nobel laureate Dudley Hirschbach has published on exactly this phenomenon in academic achievement, which is an area that he's done a lot of work on. And there's a whole host of other applications as well. The Sternins' genius was to respond to this pattern, this mathematical phenomena, not through a process of analysis or extraction and delivery, but through a process of evolution. Now, some of you, when I say that, may start to reach for your history books in some alarm, but this is not some social Darwinism. It's not a brutal survival of the fittest. In a sense, it's more like survival with the fittest. The process they developed was exactly what I described earlier, what led to bicycles and indeed human beings to come about. It's about variation, selection, and amplification. And the process was owned and managed by the community itself. The community itself facilitated the diffusion of these low-tech innovations, very profoundly important, and it enabled whole villages to rehabilitate children with minimal outside intervention by tapping into their own adaptive capabilities, allowing them to form self-organizing networks to change their own behavior on the issue that mattered most to them, their children's health. And the role of the external agencies and governments was to facilitate, support, and provide a rigorous focus on results. Now, the model was subsequently taken on and applied by the Vietnamese National Institute of Nutrition, and after this by the government, who scaled it nationally. And over time, the positive deviance approach reached 2.2 million people, and it saw a sustained reduction in malnutrition of 65 to 80%. It made a major contribution to reducing malnutrition nationally in that country. And some of you may know that positive deviance has since been applied in a whole range of settings to deal with complex problems. It's been used to reintegrate child soldiers in Uganda. It's been used to deal with MRSA in the US and in the UK. In fact, the CDC recently reviewed it and said the rates of MRSA reduction range from between 50 to 80% across US hospitals. It's been used not just by the public sector, but also by the private sector. Merck has used it. Goldman Sachs has used it to deal with sales, trader productivity. And Gary Hamel has described it as being central to the future of management in the next 10 years. It was highlighted as one of the 10 ideas most likely to change the world of management in the 2010s. I think what's really remarkable about this approach is it was developed by 2 cash-strapped aid workers working in rural Vietnam. And I think it's nothing less than a parable of managing complexity in the public sector. It's about challenging assumptions. It's about using data. It's about changing our approaches, harnessing diversity, and engaging with self-organization. And when you do all of this well, what the Sternins proved was that you can generate ideas and approaches that transcend any boundaries we have about the kinds of organizations we say we work in. Now, the key to all of this work and all of the case studies which I talk about in my book is essentially how complex systems ideas can be used to bust assumptions and change paradigms. And in particular, there are 4 assumptions which are inherent to public sector management. And I just want to talk through these quickly in conclusion.
Very quickly.
So it's about thinking about social systems not as machines, but as ecosystems. It's about dealing with people not as atomized individuals, but as part of dynamic networks. It's about understanding behaviors not as perfectly rational, but as adaptive and evolutionary. And it's about understanding change, not in a matter of building and constructing change, straight lines like the stadium that Michael described earlier, but allowing it to grow organically. Perhaps most importantly, it's about changing how we think about the public sector, not about being planners, architects and engineers in a predictable mechanical world, but about seeing them as facilitators, supporters, gardeners, stewards, curators in a ceaselessly changing complex environment. Now, having evoked Newton and Darwin, it seems only appropriate to leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein. I think it really sums up the positive deviance approach. I think it also sums up how we need to operate in the face of complexity. Thank you.
Thank you.